Thank you. Thank you very much, and delighted to be here this evening. Slightly daunted, it must be said, to be giving this little talk in the presence of such incomparably competent people in an area about which I know relatively little. But then that's how I try and educate myself as I go along. And it's given me a wonderful excuse, not least reading Lindis's paper, a wonderful excuse to try and get myself back up to speed again about some of these issues. So if what I say this evening is a little bit naive, I'm sure that Fiona and Neil and others will be a little bit tolerant as I'm in the presence of some serious experts here tonight. I couldn't resist the invitation. Max Nicholson was a great hero of mine, and indeed of anybody who was old enough to know how important Max was. And he was an extraordinary man. I don't think I've actually heard him described as a street fighter before, but that's absolutely bang on the nail, even though, of course, he was terribly respectable at one level, and that's a rare trick to pull off. So I felt it was as much in honor of him this evening to come and accept your challenge as anything else. So when I was sort of fossicking around thinking what I might say this evening, I thought, well, where can I possibly start with a good source of authority? So I went straight to the best source of authority possible, namely the Foresight Initiative, which earlier this year launched its comprehensive magisterial paper on land use futures, making the most of land in the 21st century. It is an extraordinary report. I kind of gave up on about page 150 and then recognized that I should have started with the executive summary, which would have been a lot easier. So I'm just going to give you a tiny little insight into why I suddenly, halfway through reading this report, thought, this isn't helping me very much. And then when I went back to the executive summary, I realized why. And I'm going to quote you from the executive summary. And it says this: crucially, the analysis in this report takes an even-handed view. It does not judge one type of land use to be more or less important than any other. It also contrasts the perspectives which characterize different land use communities and different expert disciplines, acknowledging the reality that these viewpoints often conflict. So I thought to myself, well, that's just a great love-in, basically, where any conflicting idea about what land use for the future means is given equal space, and we can all feel inclusive and wonderful about this because we don't need to judge one type of land use to be more or less important than another. And I thought to myself, I wonder what the Foresight panel would make of the news today about the impact, the new analysis of the impact of biofuels and the renewable transport fuels obligation across the whole of Europe. Because now that we've had a chance to go back and look at all the figures, understand the carbon balances, what we've learnt today is that far from contributing to a lower carbon liquid fuels solution for Europe, this will leave us in an infinitely worse position than we were in before. What would the Foresight panel say to that? Would they say, well, don't worry, we're not going to judge one type of land use to be more important than another? So I'm going to do something completely different. I am going to suggest that some land uses are considerably more important than other land uses. And if that causes a little bit of angst, well, not to worry, it'll all be over quite soon. But I do think the context for this is critical. And I've been going to so many different meetings at the moment. I just spent 2 days in the presence of various scientific experts at the Royal Society's Symposium on Geoengineering. And anyone who thinks that what we're talking about tonight is a sort of vaguely interesting intellectual pastime would have been, I think, shocked to the core to have heard some of those presentations about accelerating climate change, about the almost inevitable need at some point in the future to go to large-scale geoengineered solutions. The impact that that is going to have on land use is extraordinary. There was a brilliant presentation about enhancing peat bogs here in the UK that I'd never heard the like of before, the importance of biochar, importance of reforestation. It was just a rich feast of land use insights coming from a completely different place. And it made me think that really we're still stuck in a pretty primitive sense of what the future holds for us regarding sustainable land use. Now, you will have noticed I'm so far only talking about land use, and forgive me if this is already a signal of my ignorance. I will come back to landscape in a moment, but for me, landscape doesn't really mean very much unless it is contextualized through an understanding of land use. And I'm not sure whether that's a good thing to say or not. But for me, landscape is all about a weird combination of natural forces, whether we go deep into geology or whether we look at more modern times impacts on our landscapes, of cultural norms and practices, and planning, land use planning. But my starting point has to be sustainable land use. And I want to invite you all to take as your time frame this evening 2050, not 2010, 2015, but 2050. And to ask you, in your heart of hearts, can you envisage a future for the UK in which genuinely sustainable land use has become our reality in 40 years' time? So by 2050, I'll be 100 in 2050, so probably will be of minor importance to me at that point, unless I do a Max Nicholson and keep going as a street fighter all that length of time. Can you envisage what a genuinely sustainable land-use system would look like in the UK in 2050? So for me, I think it's perfectly possible to do that. You have to acknowledge that there will be fierce competition for a finite resource, not just today, but by 2050. You probably have to acknowledge, for instance, that there will be no first-generation biofuels grown on land in the UK by 2050. Because if there are still first-generation biofuels, by which I mean commodity-based crops turned into ethanol or biodiesel, whatever it might be, two things are immediately apparent. One, the innovation story that we're promised about second and third generation biofuels will not have been worth the paper it was written on. And two, it'll be game over in terms of trying to decarbonize our economy by 2050. So for me, it's a categorical inevitability that we won't be using land to produce crops for fuel by 2050. Because if we still are, we will have failed to do what we have to do. So stuff like that for me gets quite quickly very, very real in terms of competing land uses. You have to make a few assumptions. I think you must probably anticipate that the population of the UK then will be in excess of 70 million people. I'm being moderate here. It might well be a lot higher. And of course, nobody can anticipate what the state of play will be in the rest of the world in terms of possible refugee numbers coming to the UK at that stage. But just accept for now, in excess of 70 million. You probably have to acknowledge that there will be significant impacts on landscapes and land use by 2050 from accelerating climate change. I'm not going to be any more precise than that, although tons of people will take you to much more precise modeling of what those impacts look like. And we probably have to accept that we will have got some way towards our target in the UK for an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. Again, if we haven't, it's a despairing situation we face. So it is perfectly possible within these parameters to define what strictly sustainable land use patterns for the UK would look like in 2050, and I'll come back to that in a moment. However, and this is where I think it gets very crunchy, the prospects for achieving long-term sustainable land use in the UK, those prospects are completely dependent on what we succeed in doing over the next 10 to 15 years. 80% target by 2050, the politicians love that target, knowing full well that most of them will be dead by 2050. So they're very comfortable with 2050. Bring it a little bit closer, which is our target to generate 15% of all the energy this country requires, electricity, transport, and heat, 15% from renewable energy by 2020, and you will find politicians looking a great deal less complacent than they do about 2050 targets. 15% from renewables by 2020, that's just about the most eye-wateringly ambitious target we have to face here in the UK today. It means an extraordinary change in land use patterns over the course of the next 10 years. Extraordinary.